Hello and welcome to Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Bobby Pominville and I'm your arts reporter. And as you know, if you watched any of my shows, I really love the arts. Today I'm featuring an author, teacher, and artist. So I think that's pretty important, pretty neat that I've got one of my former colleagues from teaching in Hudson here today. And I'd like to welcome Evelyn Klein to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we were at the Nobel breakfast not too terribly long ago. I guess we were kind of celebrating that we weren't teaching that first day of school.
I think we were.
But anyway, at that time, she was teaching German in the schools and I was teaching music. And I do think they're quite related. I think German music's some of my favorite things, and I also like singing in German. So that is perfect for me. But now Evelyn has taken a little different direction. She has gone into writing books, and she is quite a bit into the language arts realm. And I just found out recently she's an artist too. So I'm going to ask her to tell us about her background and what led her into teaching of language arts.
Well, I started to actually get interested in language and writing and reading early in life. I think I was primarily inspired by my mother, who did a lot of reading. And when I was in elementary school, she had me read to her every day for 20 minutes. And so when it came my turn to read to the teacher, I was always pretty good. And the kids always said, well, how come you can read so well? And it didn't occur to me then that my mother really deserved the credit for making me practice at home. But this started, I really think, of a lifelong fascination with literature and writing. It was always my strongest subject, no matter how often we moved. If I struggled in math, I never struggled in language. So it was always a fun thing. And then, of course, when I got my teaching degree, I got it in language arts as well as world languages. So that was, yeah. And I started in Hudson teaching German, but then toward the end I was teaching mostly language arts. And
I didn't know that.
Yes.
I had forgotten that.
And then when I taught in South St. Paul, I taught language arts. I taught German for a while too, but toward the end it was all language arts.
Wow.
And now I teach adults, and it just keeps going.
Oh, and I just think that is so marvelous that
teachers don't ever
you made
retire.
that big leap now into teaching the adults. And that, I do want to hear more about that too. Could you tell us about, I wanted to know more about how you're using your teaching skills now. So would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, when I took my master's degree, I had a master's in the teaching of English, and very fortunately, I happened to work on Virginia Woolf.
Oh,
and that really opened the floodgates for me, because I was always sure there was a secret I didn't know about writing, and truly there was, and I discovered how it works, the writing process. And it's really led me into language arts teaching. When I was hired in South St. Paul, it was partly as a resource person for writing. And now I'm teaching writing to adults. I teach memoir, poetry, story writing, and just the whole thing. And it's
interesting.
It's just a fun way to share what I love to do.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I'm sure people really appreciate it too, because they're coming there really having a desire to learn.
Yes, yes. And often they don't realize that, you know, they're struggling on their own, and they come to a class like that, and I can show them the way in. And so then my professional track started when in the writing, when I first came to the Loft in Minneapolis, and I led a poetry group. They were looking for someone, and I happened to be looking for a poetry group, and they said, well, with your teaching background, that would be a good fit, so why don't you go ahead? And I did that for 7 years, And then I did my first book. It wasn't all mine. It was an anthology of the writers that were in that group.
Oh,
And I put
okay.
together the book Stage 2, Poetic Lives.
Okay. Let me hold that for you. And this is a collection then of some of the things that you were doing in your classroom.
Well, it was kind of an open writers group, and so
Okay.
we decided that we had come together for a numbers of years, and we said, well, Stage 2 is getting some of our work into an anthology. And so I put together the anthology. My father, who was a professional artist, did the illustrations for the book.
Oh, really? I was going to ask you.
Yes, and
Your
so-
father did them.
Yes, did those.
Okay, that's
And
beautiful.
so we were all set.
I like that very much.
I had a run of 250 books, and they were gone in no time.
Oh my! And you know, poetry is a very popular genre, don't you think? And it's almost easier for a lot of people to read poetry than to dive into something heavy.
Well, I think what I like about poetry is that you can read just one poem. If you're in a hurry, but you have 15 minutes, and you'd like to get your mind on something else, you just turn to a poem, you read it, and you have something to think about for a while, something to entertain.
Okay. Now, I didn't quite understand this, but now I see this in the front of the book. What did you mean when you said you were getting into Virginia Woolf?
Well, I did my master's thesis on Virginia Woolf.
Okay.
And I read her writer's diary. It was, she didn't call it that, but it was later on called a writer's diary. And of course, I read most of her books and discovered that really it was almost like I was reading about my own life when I read some of her books, like To the Lighthouse, because my father was a professional artist, and I grew up in that atmosphere, and she's writing about the creative atmosphere and the relationship with her father. And I thought, you know, even though my father was a totally different kind of person, but there were some aspects about it and about how society looks at women artists in particular that she kind of brought to the forefront, and it explained a lot of things to me that I was really confused on because, you know, it took a while for, and it still is not, you know, the playing field for men and women in terms of opportunity. And mobility in terms of professional mobility, it's not an equal playing field yet.
No.
And I think, so I feel that I'm growing up with that, where I'm still moving forward and learning how to, shall we say, break in.
Really? So you think it's even this area, writing books and that type of thing, is difficult to break into as far as a lady, a woman?
Well, I think it's improved greatly the last few years, and I think probably the Twin Cities area, in which I include Hudson, is certainly a really good place to be for authors, and I think women here have done very well. I think probably, I don't know, I haven't made a study of it, but I would say that they are doing well in the Twin Cities, and I do not feel that I have less opportunity here than men would have, because I think here, I think it's pretty level playing field right now.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. And it is quite a big center for literary, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And
that's what I think
and
of
you
it.
know, there are so many stereotypes about writing, just like when I was teaching high school, you know, and I'd have these football stars in my classes, and we'd write poetry, and they'd feel self-conscious about it because, you know, men don't write poetry and that sort of thing. And it really, that stereotype was pretty well dashed after the kids saw what beautiful stuff they could write.
Oh, my.
And so I think, I feel that I was part of a change from one outlook to another, and I think that's very exciting. And so I saw both boys and girls make great progress with their writing because they were able to break out of some of the stereotypes and at the same time truly develop who they are and like to be. I think writing it just gives them that opportunity. But they need help with it.
That's wonderful. I think it's a wonderful means of expression, but I just don't see everybody really getting into it like you say, football players and that. But evidently you had the right technique to get them into it. And that's wonderful, because I think self-expression is really what it's all about.
Yes, absolutely. And I've had troubled kids in classes that the minute they started writing, it was like they were starting to blossom forth and begin to understand some of their own problems. And the other students in the class, when they would share their work, would really appreciate this information in a whole new set of interactions evolved. You know, all this tension would just be diffused because of the writing, and I always felt that that was very eye-opening for me to see, and it was good to see.
Now I have to ask you this, does the grammar get in the way at all? Do you have to have a certain knowledge of grammar?
You do have to have a certain knowledge of grammar, and to be perfectly honest, what I had to do when I taught advanced composition and writing for seniors, for senior level students, to senior level students. And what I did was I did teach a crash course in some basic skills in grammar, such as sentence structure, some of the parts of speech. So because it became evident early on that if they could not understand what constituted a sentence, they could not write good sentences, and the writing would suffer.
Yes.
And so I would divide the unit into time periods, and then the first unit would be that crash course. And they did really well with just a minimum, basic ideas of, noun, verb, prepositional phrase. They'd really have most of the structure of the sentence then.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, it's inspired me to the point that I put it together in a linguistics book, which is just finished, but I still am working on the index, and then that'll go out too.
Wow.
But, and I incorporated a lot of the things about language that I taught, particularly in high school, put it together because I thought it would be such a shame, because these units were so well tried out and the kids received them so well. I thought, if I add a little more, it would also reach adults. And so now it's going to be a trade book, more or less.
Good.
And which could also be used in high schools or colleges, but it's intended for the writer, any writer.
That's wonderful.
And so I'm excited about it because my heart and soul is in it.
Well, yes, and my goodness, to get to that level and be able to achieve that, you could share a lot of your expertise.
Yes, and I just had a hard time to just discard these materials, and I thought, no, this has to be a book, and we'll see.
Oh, good. Now, this is jumping around a little, but do you have trouble getting publishers? I mean, do you have issues with that, or is that pretty equal now?
Well, I don't have, really, I have been extremely fortunate. When I first started out, I would send things out and, get it all back. Some of it I was glad I got back because you do grow in time and you see what your flaws are, and I did improve. But when my first book, From Here Across the Bridge, went out, I really didn't send it to that many publishers. When it was finally ready with all the illustrations and everything, pretty much the first publisher that I went to, it took him a while to think about it, and he showed it to different people, and he decided, well, he was going to go ahead with that.
Oh. Oh, so you were
So
very lucky.
I was very fortunate, and I had a similar experience with my second book, even though I went to a different publisher with that. But sometimes, you know, I always feel I have to grow in some ways. And that's just how my mind works. And so I did go with North Star for the second one. I went with Noden Press for my first book.
Okay.
And both experiences have been very good. And I must say, both of these publishers publish a lot of women. So, and I think they're very equitable in that regard.
Wonderful.
So I don't think I personally have encountered any prejudice in that regard. But, you know, it was in the past. It was, you know, we have women writing in pen names because
That's true.
because they were afraid to get out there. And Virginia Woolf talks about it. And I think the Virginia Woolf period, which is kind of the early to mid 20th century, was kind of the turning point for women to get out there. And maybe some of us grew up with the notion that women don't have the same opportunities. But in the meantime, some of us have worked hard to open up these opportunities. We grew up with that generation that said, oh, we can do it too.
That's good. That's
and
good. I'm
and
glad
we're
to hear
doing
that.
it. Yeah.
I
and we're
really
doing
thought
it.
you were going to give me the other answer. Like,
No.
oh, yeah, it's been very difficult. But that's
No.
really nice to hear that. So your first book really then is From Here Across the Bridge.
Yes.
And was that inspired by a certain area? Did you tell me that? Or?
Well, it's a memoir, actually. It's a memoir written in poetry, which takes place in Hudson, Milwaukee, and a little bit in the Twin Cities.
Okay.
And it covers a period of my life where I went through a lot of spiritual and developmental changes brought on by the circumstances in which I lived.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really a breakthrough for me in terms of writing and putting it together. And I wasn't really aware I was writing a memoir until I was done with it. And then I realized, oh yes, you know, this is a memoir. This is not just poetry, isolated poems, although you can read the poems in isolation, but if you read them in sequence, you get a story.
Oh, I see. Very good.
Yeah. So, and then of course, once I had it written, I talked my father into reading it, and he said, well, I'm not a poet. I don't think I should read this. And I said, but you're my dad, and you may want to read what I've written. And I did really want his reaction, and my mother's as well.
Yes.
And he did read it, and he was quite amazed. And he said, boy, this is not just a story, this is a whole life story. So there's a lot in there. And he was so pleased that he said, well, now if you want to put some pictures in there, you can have some of my pictures to put in there.
Oh, wonderful.
And I was absolutely in awe that he would offer that. And I chose the pictures according to the way I thought they would fit with the story.
Yes.
And maybe they would not have been quite the ones he would have suggested, but they did make it in there. And as a matter of fact, the cover picture is a covered bridge, and that's one of the last wooden covered bridges in Wisconsin.
Yes.
And you may have seen it on some travel brochures and things like that, but my dad went out and did it in person.
That's very good.
He did a lot of woodcuts, and so in there are then some more woodcuts.
And that fits very well with the theme, I would think.
Yes.
And very nice to have your father involved.
Yes, I was really thrilled. I never thought that he and I would be collaborating in a sense.
That's
and
wonderful.
But then when it came to my second book, I was kind of sad because he was no longer there, and I needed different kind of artwork.
Oh, yes.
And that's really when I came out of the closet, and I didn't realize myself that within my very cool composure was an artist just dying to get out.
And you hadn't really ever done it?
Well, I had had an experience in 8th grade with art that was rather a big disappointment to me, and I never mentioned it to my dad. I was so embarrassed about it.
That's too bad.
I had just put it out of my mind. He was the artist. How could I ever measure up?
Oh, yes, that's a lot of pressure.
Yes, and he was so good and so quick about it. But he, over the years, I did take some lessons from him. I was very grateful I did that.
That's good.
And also, when he wrote his book on perspective drawing, I helped him with that. And I did a lot of the typing of it. And so I think that gave me the courage. I'll just sit in my car and do it. And I did it. And it was just great fun.
And this is the result.
Yes.
And that's wonderful.
It's a collage of skylines.
Yes.
On top is Minneapolis, on bottom is St. Paul.
Yes, I recognize that.
Yeah, and and then in between is the Fort Snelling, the old Fort Snelling building.
Oh, yes.
And so I thought that would be an appropriate connection between the two.
Yes.
And it was just great fun to do it, and the publisher liked it. I first had the cover just in graphite pencil, and she thought, well, you know, if you could do this in color, that would be great. And I said,
oh, yes. Oh, I love
okay.
the color.
Give me a couple of weeks and I will do it.
And you redid it.
And I redid it. So it's in there in both versions. In the back,
my goodness.
on the last section, it's the original version, and the cover is the colored version.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. And it was just
nice?
Fun to do.
Yes, I love your depiction here of the two cities and how you separated it, and just like the river. That's very nice. Once upon a neighborhood. Now, what is the significance of that?
Well, it occurred to me that, you know, we're really so dependent on neighborhoods, but the question is, what constitutes a neighborhood? I think the idea has really changed. And I used to live in that neighborhood where I wrote a lot of the poems in a different area, but of course it all had changed over the years. Right. And yet somehow it still was the neighborhood. And so I'm writing about, you know, neighborhood as it is changing, and we may not have the same notion of neighborhood. We don't have everything in one neighborhood anymore, but we move from area to area, and each is a neighborhood in a sense in our lives, because our activities take us different places. And so we create new connections, new relationships in those areas, and so we become attached to those for the new relationships that we have formed.
And you had a very positive experience in these neighborhoods.
I did, yes.
And that,
very
I don't know
nurturing.
why, but that surprises me a little, you know, to be in the cities and having that wonderful experience and having neighbors that were so kind and nice to you.
And to each other. I think a lot of it is watching the interaction between them was absolutely very reassuring, that the neighborhoods in the old-fashioned sense really still do exist. And I don't know how common they are, but certainly it was at its best there, where the neighbors looked out for each other, you know, regardless of what age they were, and there was a certain familiarity without being intrusive, I think. That's very important, not to be intrusive and become the nosy neighbor.
Oh, yes.
Because that can be problematic, but I didn't notice that particularly there. So,
Well, it's very nice the way you have this. I think it's very, I don't know, it just draws you in with that artwork. And then the theme seems to be so positive. So that is very nice. So that was your what, third book?
That was my second book.
Second book. All right.
And my third book, I'm currently just finishing up.
Right.
That's going to be called Seasons of Desire.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be kind of a spiritual book, spiritual developmental. So being that I've been in education, psychology is always right around the corner, and I'm also part of the Minnesota Young Association. I'm a member there.
Oh.
And so, and I've always thought, you know, when I took my education courses, we learned about developmental tasks and, you know, for all these different ages, which stopped
Yes.
in teenage. And I thought, you know, but that's not really where it ends, is it? It keeps right on going through life. And I'm addressing that, and I'm leaning a little bit on Carl Jung to help me out with that. But, you know, for the most part, I'm talking about things that I have observed teaching adults now. And, you know, when you teach, you really see what the needs are, and you know what your own needs are, and then you see, oh, everybody else has similar needs going down the road, and depending on where you are. And I thought, there's very little talk about that, and yet we talk about change. And I thought, maybe what we need is a little encouragement to help us realize that these changes are not roadblocks, but they're opportunities for developing who we are and what we can do. And so this third book is going to be about that. So it'll have prose that will talk about some actual situations, and then the poetry to support some more of that and put that into the spiritual light
It sounds like a very
of
good
that
theme.
journey. So I'm really excited about it, and I think I was supposed to turn that in to the publisher a year ago, but I got so involved in expanding it and doing the illustrations that I'm just now finishing it, and hopefully it'll go out this fall.
So when you're writing, is it a certain day? Is it a certain beginning to the day? Or do you just all of a sudden get a brainstorm and you go, oh, I must go write that down?
Well,
how do you get inspired to do that?
Yeah, well, the thing is, the more you write, the more you're inspired. And the way I'm going right now is that if I don't write every day, there's a part of my life missing. So what I have started to do is to write in the morning. That's what I do first thing before I do breakfast, and then I sit down to write. And it isn't until afternoon that I do other chores and other things. That's why I teach in the evening now, because I don't want to give up my mornings. They are strictly for writing. And, you know, and somebody asked me once, well, oh, you have this discipline. But it's really not discipline. It's kind of like when you're really hungry and you're running in the house and you want to eat something right away. It's kind of like that with writing. When you have this, you wake up from a dream state or whatever, and your mind is just filled with things you can't wait to get on paper. And so it becomes, for me, most of the time, it's an automatic process. And if I sometimes have to be busy with other things in the morning, after a while, it wears on me literally. So I have to get back to that, because that's my way to have the day right side up.
That must be really hard to dictate every morning. You know, that would be difficult.
Well, the thing is, the more you write, the more the ideas pop in your head. And I have the kind of mind that just doesn't ever shut off. And the only way to shut it off
Yeah.
is to write it down.
Mm-hmm.
Then I can relax and go on to other things.
Yeah.
And so that's why,
So you really have an urgency to do that
yes,
right away
yes,
in the morning.
yes. Uh-huh.
And do you ever feel like sometimes you're dreaming some of your story parts, or do you feel like you're getting answers
Oh, yes.
as you
sometimes.
process during the nighttime hours?
Oh, absolutely.
And then sometimes I would assume, I don't know, if you do wake up and you kind of recall something, and then you think, oh, that would be good in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Dreams are very important.
Yes, they are.
And you know, and at night we do process a lot of information. If I'm puzzled about something or not sure about something,
Yes.
you know, I always tell myself,
I
well,
know what you're
sleep on
saying
it.
here.
You know, and sooner or later the answer comes.
Yes.
The less you push it,
Mm-hmm.
the more likely the answer will come. If you sit down and try to force it, it's not going to. It's going to run away and hide. I don't know.
Yeah, because I can recall having teacher dreams back, you know, in the day. And, you know, once in a while I'll still have one.
Yeah.
And it was all about going well or not going well in the classroom and what I could do to make it better. And sometimes I would wake up and go, oh, I have a new vision. I'm going to go to school and I'm going to really have a good day, and I'm going to be able to communicate better with these students.
Yes.
And sometimes it does happen that way.
Yes. Yes.
And then other
absolutely.
times, you don't get that vision.
No, you can't. Unfortunately, you can't program it and you
Nope.
can't predict it.
That's
It
right.
comes when it will.
You really can't. So now tell me though, how did you develop this artistic skill? If you hadn't really studied art, but it was all around you with your father, and you had a little bit of reluctance, you might say, because like you said, how could you be as good as he was? I can see where that would be very difficult. So did you have to study some art, or did it just flow out of you?
Well, I really haven't studied a whole lot of art. I did a couple of classes on,
okay.
you know, technique for drawing, but I think most of what I use, I really learned from my dad.
Oh.
You know, and when you have a father that is, when he worked, the whole house was his studio in a sense. He'd tape things on the walls and work on them. I think subconsciously you pick it up. And I remember when I was already an adult and I was trying to do some fashion drawings, I took some lessons for him then. And I asked him some questions about some of his positions and poses when he would work. And it seemed so strange. And he would explain to me why he did that, how you measure something that you're looking at in order to get the proportions right. And so he gave me a lot of very important information. And I do think that I used my artistic bent, if you will, in other ways. I always loved decorating and colors.
Oh, yes.
And sewing.
Yes.
And he always regarded that as my artistic expression. I was sometimes surprised because it was just what women do. Don't all women do that? And but he saw this as my artistic expression, and it's something that comes easly. Both of my parents enjoyed colors. My mother was very good at decorating too. And so I think some of it I picked up from her, some from my dad. It's really hard to say, but when you live in that kind of environment, you're bound, something is bound to stick and go with you. And I felt when I sat down to start the illustrations for my new book, it was almost like my dad was right there behind me. it was uncanny, and it was almost like, you know, a note of approval, even though he had already passed on. But I had the sense that he was there with me in spirit.
That's very satisfying.
Yeah, it was
It's good to hear that.
It was very important to me.
Yes, of course.
And so I feel almost like I'm continuing what he started, maybe in a different way.
And you always had that talent.
It was kind of dormant, I think, in some ways.
It doesn't always come easily.
No.
And I can totally identify with that. And being afraid not to measure up, you know, to a parent or somebody who's so outstanding and in that area, and then you're almost afraid to even try.
I think there is something to that.
So there must be a lot of satisfaction for you to come out with this and find, oh, I can draw. I can express this way.
Well, I only wish I had let myself do it sooner. I think I fully realized it was my decision not to do it.
Right.
And I had a similar experience in one of the classes that I took, where we were asked to do something, and for some reason I messed it up. There were two of us who messed it up, and she went around telling everyone how wonderful. And then, of course, she came to two of us, and I felt that same feeling I had when I was in 8th grade.
Oh.
And I thought, should I leave now? And I thought, no, you're not going to leave now. You're never going to leave. So you messed it up, and she said it was messed up, and that's fine. I'll just start over. And
good.
So
Very good.
And I think once I overcame that moment of failure, I realized, yeah, you mess things up once in a while, but that's no reason to give up, you know?
That's true.
And so, and that's really, that new outlook has really helped me work through my new illustrations, because there are times when it is messed up and you think, but then the thing is not to say I give up, but what is it that that messed it up? What is wrong? You know, like one of the illustrations, I couldn't figure it out. It looked just strangely distorted on paper. And then I realized, well, I had the perspective wrong. And once I realized it and I revised it, it was just fine.
Really?
Yeah. And
you have to be your own critic. And
oh, you absolutely. And then I was able to work it out so that it, you know, didn't show that there was a mess up and a correction.
Oh,
and
yes. Well, that's good.
So that was a
Good
very
for you.
important thing to learn.
So how now when you're out and about and where do you teach these classes now? You mentioned the Loft. Is that one place?
I taught for some time at the Loft in Minneapolis.
Oh, okay.
And then talk about coincidences, I took those drawing classes at Century College.
Oh.
And the first class, actually that was the one where I goofed up, that one picture. We were invited to display one of our pictures. They had a year-end display of all student artwork.
Oh, yes.
And as this exhibit opened, I was introduced to the person who is the continuing ed director at Century College. And when she found out I taught at the Loft, she said, oh, I always wanted to work with the Loft. Would you like to teach for me here?
Oh, good.
And she's just a wonderful person to work with.
Wow, that's
And
nice.
so I have been teaching some classes there, but and she's very enthusiastic, very positive person to work with.
Isn't that nice?
Yes, it's been
So you
really
made
fun.
a very wonderful connection there.
Yes, and just knowing her as a person, I think, has been
Good.
a wonderful
Good.
experience.
So would you ever come to Hudson to do it if the opportunity arose?
Oh, sure, I would do.
You never know.
I don't want to do too many, I don't, when I teach at Century, I don't teach at the loft because I don't want to teach too much because I need to have time to write.
That's true.
And so I do
takes
limit
time.
it, but if we can schedule it in well enough in advance, and it depends. Sometimes I'm asked to do workshops, like for the Bloomington Book Fair. I did one last year on what is poetry,
Oh my.
and it was really fun. It was only an hour. I wish I would have had 2 hours. It would have been better if we'd have had 2 hours, but it was a 1-hour workshop. And but it was well attended and well received and a lot of fun to teach.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow. I was just thinking that you could so easily get connected into the FIPS or community ed, and then our libraries. I don't know if they have workshops like that.
I don't know if they do.
I
They do
really
have
don't
my
know.
books, though.
That's right. So that's good.
do.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I
Yes.
wanted our audience to know
Yes.
where they could get the books, and that would be Hudson Public Library.
And they're also available for purchase in Hudson at the new Chapter 2 bookstore.
Oh.
And also
right downtown.
downtown on Main Street.
Yes.
Also at Times and Lavender gift shop.
Oh, I like that place.
Yeah.
I know Michelle. I have to stop in there
It's
and
a
check that
wonderful
out.
little place. And
they've been very supportive to a lot of my endeavors
yes.
with the Women's Club.
Yes.
So I definitely will go in there and check that out.
Yeah. And
Oh, nice
so-
little shop. I really like what she's done with it.
In River Falls, they have the book at the public library. They have both books. They
Okay.
also, the University of Wisconsin River Falls has both books in their library.
Oh, good.
There aren't a whole lot of bookstores here, but you know.
No, and they're sort of dwindling. It's sort of the
Yes.
trend, don't you think?
Yes, but they can also be bought at Common Good Books in
Okay.
St. Paul, Garrison
right.
Keeler's bookstore,
Oh,
and on Amazon.com, and of course you can always get them from me as well.
yes, yes.
So
Well,
those are the places where
I
but-
never dreamed they'd be available so many different places.
Well, and also, they're also at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They have the
Oh,
Once Upon a
yes.
Neighborhood book
oh,
there.
do they? Oh,
Yes.
sweet. Oh, that's one of my favorite destinations.
Yeah.
At least
So-
once a year.
Well, I was very excited when they were interested in this book. So, and the Minnesota State Historical Society has Once Upon a Neighborhood on their permanent shelf now. So I felt,
And that is what, near the Capitol?
yeah,
that's what I'm thinking of, I think.
closer to the St. Paul Cathedral.
Oh,
Actually,
okay.
kind of kitty corner from the St. Paul Cathedral.
All right. Yeah, it's been, the new one. I'm thinking of something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that new building.
The
I've
History
actually
Center.
been there.
Yeah, it's off Kellogg
Yeah.
Boulevard there.
That's
Yeah.
a wonderful. Well, should we try our philosophical question about reading?
By all means.
Because I think we're having a really good interview, Evelyn.
Well,
so we got one more
I'm
question,
enjoying it. All right.
and I'm really looking forward to your answer too. Because I would like to ask you the question, what is the importance of reading in today's technological world? I mean, why should we be emphasizing reading so much?
Oh, it's an absolute must more than ever. When I taught in South St. Paul, they had this program, Teacher in the Workplace, where the teachers were sent out to find out what were the skills that are needed to be successful out in the world.
Yes.
And one place I went to was Westlaw, and the other was a travel agency. And both of them very clearly indicated that writing and reading are the most important skills. And even handwriting, because I know there's this controversy now and especially the travel agencies said, there come these times when you have to write someone a handwritten note. And if you can't
It's kind
read
of
it,
rare in this world, but
when
you're
you
right.
can't read it, you have a problem.
Yeah.
But it goes really further than that. Everything is computerized, and computers use reading and writing skills to communicate very important information. Even, there is no level of work that doesn't require some kind of reading and writing skill. Even factory workers are using computers nowadays to get their work done. So I would say, from personal experience in industry and by talking to industry, I would say that these are important skills to have in the workforce. And moreover, I think they're very important for personal use as well. With Facebook and all the, in blogs and all that, it's really important to be able to express yourself in a way that is clear and not confusing. Even, if we're not all going to be Carl Sandburg or Emily Dickinson, but we want to make ourselves understood. And what people sometimes don't realize is that if you use language incorrectly, very often it can lead to confusion and inaccuracies. So I do think that the writing skill is not diminishing. It may show up in different ways. We may write on Facebook instead of a letter, or an email instead of a card, but we're still going to want to express those things. As a matter of fact, if we don't send a greeting card, we have to think of the whole message ourselves. So an email, we're stuck even more with our own writing. So, and there's nothing wrong with starting a new style, but it has to be one that can be understood and communicates well and is acceptable in the world. So, and that's what communication is, really. It is connecting with others. Because if we write just for ourselves, we're really not reaching that audience. We don't reach that connection that lets us grow and others grow and have this interchange.
Yes, well said. And I just totally agree with you. And I've always thought it's important, but I think it's more important now than ever.
Yes.
That we must foster that, because I do worry about the lack of interest in it sometimes.
Right.
That's out there today.
Right.
But anyway, I love your answer. Really enjoyed the interview. Best of luck to you in your career.
Well, thank you.
And I'm sure I'll be seeing you again. And I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And you'll have to look around for some of Evelyn's books. They're very, very accessible, even in Hudson. So thanks for watching today.
And thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.